I'm Grant Threlkeld, and this is my Module 13 case study. For a summary, Mrs. Wilson is the principal at Crestview Elementary. She has a teacher, Mrs. Horton, who's struggled more this school year, specifically in getting along with other teachers and parents. When there was a conference with a parent, the situation escalated, and Mrs. Horton yelled to defend herself. The parent would like for their child, Julie, to be moved out of Mrs. Horton's class as soon as possible. First thing I have to look at is, what do I know? Mrs. Wilson is the principal at Crestview Elementary. There are 18 classroom teachers, a media specialist, counselor, 2 special education teachers, and 3 classroom aides. As of 3 years ago, the attendance was good, as were the test scores, and parents overall were happy. And that Mrs. Horton is a first grade teacher and a former Teacher of the Year candidate. However, towards the end of year 3 of Mrs. Wilson's principalship, Mrs. Horton's husband moved out, and Mrs. Horton's attitudes and actions have taken a nosedive. I also know that after Mrs. Horton's husband moved out, she began spending less time at school outside of the typical school hours, where before she would be spending weekends and holiday breaks up at school. Now she's spending less time. She has become more confrontational with any person who disagrees with her. And this school year, the school was chosen to pilot a new reading program. The majority of the staff was in favor of the change, including the principal, Mrs. Wilson. However, Mrs. Horton was strongly opposed to it and has been criticizing anyone who agreed with the program. A conference was held about Mrs. Horton's attitude towards the new reading program, and it was reported that her attitude had not changed. We know that there have been complaints in this school year within the first 6 weeks to the principal, Mrs. Wilson, and to the school board members, to the point that the superintendent called Mrs. Wilson asking letting her know what the problem was. Many of the complaints have been alleging that Mrs. Horton is being verbally abusive and that she is also refusing to hold parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Wilson has performed walkthroughs in the classroom and has not seen evidence of the verbal abuse. However, this was not the answer that some parents were looking for, and they are continuing to pursue their complaints. Mrs. Horton has also been arriving late to work several days a week. We also know that Julie, one of the students in Mrs. Horton's first grade class, came up to school insisting on a conference with the principal, Mrs. Wilson, and Mrs. Horton. And Mrs. Wilson told Mrs. Horton about the meeting, and she was defensive, but agreed to attend the scheduled meeting for the next morning. When it was time for the meeting, Mrs. Horton began rummaging through her desk looking for Julie's grades, and this was not what Julie's dad would have liked. And when asked about the purpose of the meeting, he stated that he and his wife wanted Julie out of Mrs. Horton's class. When Mrs. Horton heard some of these accusations, she became very defensive and began yelling to defend her position. Mrs. Wilson immediately ended the meeting and assured Julie's dad that there would be a solution on Julie's classroom placement in the near future. When Mrs. Wilson turned back to look at Mrs. Horton appeared angry and her posture was defensive. Now we need to look at, what do I need to know? The first thing that I need to know is, what's the makeup of Mrs. Wilson's classroom? I know that in some schools they will divide up students based on what the teacher's strengths are. And it could be that Mrs. Wilson has been getting classes that have been more difficult than some of her peers, which could be leading to some of her frustration. I'd also like to know, when was Mrs. Wilson's last evaluation? And how did she score on that? Was there anything that would give implications that maybe she was taking a turn for the worse? I'd also need to know, when the superintendent called, did he already have a solution in mind that he wanted done? I'd also would need to know if there have been any accusations of verbal abuse in any of the previous school years, or if it's just been this school year. I'd specifically like to look at last school year after Mrs. Horton's husband left to see if there was anything there. I'd also like to know how long ago was Mrs. Horton a Teacher of the Year candidate, because that would show kind of where that passion is and if she's still passionate about the field. And then I'd also have a question about what's the school policy on teacher arrival time? Is it set in stone of all teachers must arrive by a specific time, or is it up to the principal's judgment of they need to be here at least 5 minutes before students and 25 minutes after, leading to 30 minutes, but that time is more flexible. I would like to know if Mrs. Wilson was already on a plan of improvement due to some of the belittling comments that she had made to her peers in regards to the reading curriculum. I'd also like to know what are the dynamics of her first grade team. Because it's mentioned that she doesn't necessarily get along with them, but is that because it's not necessarily an open environment for all to share? I'd also like to know if Mrs. Horton's skills are most applicable to first grade. Maybe she needs to move to a different grade level where the students are more independent. I'd also like to know does the school have a classroom management plan on how to work with students who are presenting difficulties in the classroom? Including things like, has Mrs. Horton sent any students to the office for discipline issues? And then I'd also like to know what does their negotiated agreement or teacher contract say about teacher discipline and what steps need to be taken? Which leads me to what's the problem? The problem is communication with students, other staff members, and parents appears to be less than ideal, specifically when looking at Mrs. Horton. It appears as though there are other issues outside of the school setting that are impacting Mrs. Horton's teaching ability. The relationship between Julie's parents and Mrs. Horton appears to be damaged. And there is the potential that if the issue is unresolved, it may lead to dissatisfaction among parents and other staff members. Parents in the regards that Julie's parents may start talking about, well, Mrs. Wilson lets Mrs. Horton do whatever she wants, which can then lead to some issues with the community relations and with other staff members in similar regards, that if they don't see corrective action taking place with Mrs. Horton, then again, it leads to the idea that perhaps Mrs. Wilson is playing favorites, and that's not wanted. So the next category is my proposed action plan. The first thing is that within 24 hours, I want to have a conversation with Mrs. Horton, asking for her side of the story. There's a popular saying that there are three sides to any situation: their side, my side, and the truth. And by getting each person's side, I can maybe get more information that can help me make a better decision. I'd also want to review what are the conditions of the negotiated agreement. And I would let Mrs. Horton know that I would be following up with her on a plan of action within a week. I would also want to talk to her colleagues and what they've seen or heard in the first grade pod. Have they heard any yelling? Have they heard anything that is detrimental? So that way I can get more than just the perspective of the two parties involved. And I would also follow up with the superintendent on what steps being taken and if he has any other suggestions. After the week, I would meet with Mrs. Horton to outlining how to resolve the issues. There would be certain stipulations that I would want put in place. Number one, a minimum of 5 walkthroughs per week. I would not set a maximum, so that way I could be in the classroom at different moments. So that way she's not counting down and going, okay, I've seen this person, I've seen the principal as many times as I need to. They're not going to be coming in. Any parent communication, I would want responded to in 24 hours, and I would want to be carbon copied on all of them so that I can see what's being said. And also, so that way we're giving the assurance to parents that